Oh, hello. My name is Mara, and welcome to Books Like Whoa. Okay guys, now that I have finished reading all of the books in the Book of the Ancestor series by Mark Lawrence, I wanted to give you a review / mostly just me gushing about this series and how much I love it. Now, I am not going to do spoilers in this, so I'm not going to get into any kind of plot-specific things, I don't think, that would tell you what happens or like give any big things away. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by talking about the premise and kind of like the overall setup of the book, like the kind of thing you would get sort of from the back cover of the first book. Then I'm going to tell you like kind of at a high level my thoughts and kind of some of the things I love. And then I'm pretty much, I think, just going to go like thematically point by point of why this book makes me, why this whole series makes me so happy. So again, I don't think it'll be any like plot spoilers or really probably even like character spoilers, but if you consider any discussion of like the themes or elements of the book that are present to be a spoiler, like now's your warning. Please don't come at me in the comments. I've given you plenty of notice, but let's just start with me telling you why I love this series so much and why I think you should probably read it. So the Book of the Ancestors trilogy consists of 3 books, hence trilogy, as well as one short story that comes between books 2 and 3, which I think is really good. So I would recommend reading that as well. And the first book is called Red Sister, the second book is called Gray Sister, and the third book is called Holy Sister. That little novella is called Bound. And in terms of sort of the setup of this, this is a fantasy trilogy. So, and I say that, and we'll get more into this in the part of this that I love. It is a fantasy trilogy, but I would argue that it definitely has some like definite sci-fi elements to its underlying mythology. So maybe kind of like speculative fiction might be a good qualifier for this. But in terms of just sort of ostensibly how it reads, it definitely reads like a fantasy. And it is about our main character, Nona Gray, who we meet on the morning of her execution. So she is set to go to the gallows for killing someone. And we kind of in flashback in the first story get the rundown on exactly what happened and kind of what has led her to this moment. But at the last minute, she is saved by Abbess Glass, who is in charge of the Sweet Mercy Convent. And this is a convent that is basically filled with warrior assassin nuns. And they have warrior assassin nun convent school, aka boarding school, for girls to become warrior assassins themselves. So she comes and sort of like through shenanigans is able to save Nona from the hangman's noose, and she takes Nona to Sweet Mercy and essentially indoctrinates her, says like, hey, you're gonna worship their god, which is called the Ancestor, hence Book of the Ancestor, that's their religious text, and you're gonna be a nun, and we're gonna teach you everything we know about meth and like how to poison people and how to fight and all of the things. And basically the trilogy is following Nona's journey through her time at the schools. There are 4 different classes. You start when you're like 8 or 9, which is how old she is at the beginning. And you progress through first in Red class, then in Gray class, then in Mystic class, and then in Holy class. And after that, you take your vows and you become a nun. And there's a few different types of nuns. So like the Gray sisters are sort of like the sneaky, like spy version of being a nun. The Red sisters are like the straight up sort of like fighters. There are Holy sisters who are more specifically devoted to like worship, and then Mystic sisters who are using the magic in this world to walk the path. So a lot of the time in this book is spent with Nona as she is in school and kind of growing in her powers and figuring out how she is like where she's gonna fit within the world, within her order, like which kind of sister is she gonna be? And, you know, we follow her friends as well. But there's also a much bigger political story happening over the course of the 3 books, but in each book we get like a big chunk of what is going on. And basically a lot of what's happening, because I don't want to get into too many specifics, because I actually really quite like the way this story kind of unfolds in terms of you growing in your understanding of kind of what is at stake. But I think it's fair to say that the world that this book is set in is in real crisis mode. There are already a lot of scarce resources, and as things are progressing in terms of the climate situation they find themselves in, things are getting worse, and there is a couple of like kind of last pulls to try to get power as the world literally around them is changing. So there's been a lot of sort of like political upheaval that's been kind of brewing. There's also a lot of religious upheaval, and Abbess Glass, who runs that convent of Sweet Mercy, is definitely kind of at the heart of a lot of what's going on with that. So in addition to sort of a tradition, maybe sort of like coming of age novel or like Bildungsroman type thing, there's also really like a lot of this is like a political novel in a lot of ways. And as you go through the books, you definitely are building on a lot of things from the previous one. Like this is definitely one big story broken up, I think appropriately into various chunks. But I would say in terms of just to give you kind of my impression of this, when I first read Red Sister, which is the first one, and I'm waiting for my physical copy to arrive because it's taken me a while to find a reasonably priced hardback because I want to have matching series. When I first read Red Sister, I was instantly like, oh, I really am into this world. I'm into these characters. We'll get into more about that later. I really like this. I'm definitely going to keep going. And it was, I think, in my top fantasy novels of last year. Really, really liked it. Gave it a 4-star because it does have this thing where it is intercutting between time periods a lot in the first book, and I thought some of that was more effective than other parts. I felt like overall it happened too much in sort of the reveal in the first book. I didn't think merited all of that back and forth that was happening. So that was why it was a 4-star and not a 4.5. However, then I got to Grey Sister, and Grey Sister I think is the strongest of the 3 books. It's the middle chapter, and like kudos to him, to Mark Lawrence, for writing a textbook second book in a trilogy. Like, if you have seen my rant about A Gathering of Shadows, this does everything correctly that book did not do well. Not to shade it too much. I'm just, as a point of contrast, if you kind of know how I think about the function of a second book in a trilogy, which is it's in the tricky position of it has to be interesting in and of itself, but it also has to like propel the macro plot forward. This does an absolutely excellent job with that. This is 4.5 stars. Like, this is definitely one of my favorite things I've read this year. And I just think it was doing so many things so well. And I think one of the things that it chose to do was to mostly stay linear, which I think was to its benefit. So I gave this a 4.5. I gave the bridging novella, which is really more of like a short story, I gave that 4.5 as well. It is a fantasy setting I love with a murder mystery plot and strong romantic elements, which is like all of my catnip in one short story. It was really good. It's one of the best novellas of that type I've read in quite some time. So I thought that was really great. And then he totally nails the landing, I think, in Holy Sister. Now, I gave this 4 stars because I was conflicted about some of the choices made in this in terms of structurally and in terms of where certain things ended up. And I don't want to say more than that because obviously I'm trying to not get too spoilery. So I gave this 4 stars. It was between a 4 and a 4.5. I think because I loved this one so much. I didn't like this one quite as much, but I did like it better than the first book. So I actually think that this, in terms of order, I liked this one the best, this second, and the first one the least amount. And I really, really liked it. Like, it was on my favorites last year. So overall, I would give this trilogy a 4.5 star. Like, it's one of the best fantasy trilogies I've ever read. And I think now maybe we can transition into me just gushing about all the things that this series does really well. But at a high level, before we get into that, let me just say that I think I would be hard pressed to think of someone I wouldn't recommend this trilogy to. I guess my caveat is if you just don't like fantasy, you may not like this, but I think that there is so much to please in this series. Like, it just has a lot going on, both in terms of the actual plot, and characters, like all of the real, like the meat of it as a story has a lot going on, but then thematically it is also really effective, I think, and has a lot of interesting things it's playing with and saying. So in terms of the entertainment value, that is 100% there. In terms of like the writing quality and like the strength of like character, all of that is there. And then it also has something it's trying to say. And for a fantasy or a sci-fi book, I mean, it's all about metaphor. Like, it's an entire genre built on metaphor. And I just think that this really delivers in terms of its sort of like what it has to say, quality, its themes, all of that. So I definitely recommend the series, and now I'm just gonna like gush about all the things that are awesome about this. So just to like keep this organized, let's start with world, then we'll go to plot, then we'll go to characters, then we'll go to themes. And I'm gonna try not to make this too long because I could honestly talk about this for a very long time. So, premise. warrior assassin nuns. That is awesome. Like, I think that was handled so well. It never veered into like stereotypical like kick-ass heroines that's just sort of like standard in a lot of urban fantasy stuff. It's not that. Like, this is genuinely a bunch of women who are very competent. Maybe this is veering into character, so let me push pause on that. But like, just the setup of the idea that this is a convent full of warrior assassin nuns, that is awesome. This is a world that is almost completely covered in ice, and there's only like essentially around the equator like a tiny strip of land that is still livable, and there's like a moon that they've put up in the sky to be able to like focus whatever sunlight there is to like keep it from not melting. That is super cool. There's all of these like people in the distant past who, I don't want to get too spoilery, but like the deep backstory of this is very sci-fi, which is very cool. And it's basically like the premise is like a fight about climate change, which is so relevant to our contemporary moment, but also it's just like a super, I think, great take in fantasy. I mean, like, the whole winter is coming of Game of Thrones, right? Like, there's definitely, I think, the idea of like having a force outside of the immediate control of any of the characters as like your ultimate like impending problem is very effective. So just premise-wise, this is awesome. Plot-wise, oh my gosh, guys, like, I just think, like I said, I do have a couple of structural and pacing quibbles with the first and the third book, which is what kept it from being a 4.5 star for me. But I think if you take so, you know, that's true on an individual story level, but even that, I mean, like, I think the individual books in this series, each of them work really well. Like, they're satisfying books in and of themselves, like they're satisfying stories in and of themselves. And he was very smart in how he parceled out each of the conflicts for each of the books and kind of divvied that up. So I think that they work really well individually. But then when you look at the overall macro plot of this, of Nona coming of age and like from about 8 to 18, I just think that like it's really well done. It's really smart. And you know what really just took these books over the edge is that like there are twists throughout each of these books that I think are really effective. Like, they don't feel like cheap twists. They feel earned and they feel exciting. Like, part of the smart choice he made was to have Abbess Glass be so involved in everything, because her character basically is set up to be like this master puppeteer kind of. So like, you never quite know what she's up to, and like that leads to some very satisfying kind of progressions in the plot. Some of them you can see coming, like, sure, and especially once you kind of realize that's part of what this book is doing. But even if you can see them coming, I think because they feel earned and they feel like they take the story in an interesting direction, I was fine with that. Like, I love that this series keeps moving in interesting directions throughout all three books. I think that that is so great. And even in that short story I mentioned that comes between books 2 and 3, even that I think is a great example of like an interesting mystery plot to put in this fantasy setting. Like, I really recommend that short story, by the way. It wasn't like as amazing as All Systems Red by Martha Wells, but I think it's another great example of short genre fiction done really well. So I think just the plots in these really work. The characters are so great. Like, Nona is she's flawed, but not in the sort of like typical way that these types of like really aggressive or really like badass heroines can be flawed. I think she's unique. I think she has a certain naivete to her that is really, I think, an interesting layer to her character. And I think seeing her grow from a child to an adult is a very satisfying process as the reader in terms of like the character development. Like, you can see her growing and learning, but she has these certain core values to who she is that is very valuable. And, you know, kind of veering into thematic here, but in all of his characters, I think he does a really interesting job of kind of playing with what is intrinsic about them versus what are their own choices. And I think especially with Nona, we have a lot of interesting ideas around what is a result of the fact that she is this very rare thing, which is a triple blood in this world. And I won't get into the whole thing because you can just discover that for yourself. But like, what about that part of her makes her who she is versus what is her backstory, her family, and like the friends around her. I think that is often in a chosen one type narrative, something that kind of can get played with. And I think he does a really effective job of that. Again, one thing that I think Mark Lawrence deserves serious credit for, and it's very sad we have to say this, but I think we do, is the fact that this is a book that is peopled almost entirely by women. There are very few notable male characters in this book, and like pretty much all of them are in some way or other like the playthings of the women of this book. Like either they're, a villain who the women are sort of working their way around and like manipulating and getting to do what they want. They're like, somebody to warm their furs, or I don't know. I just sort of love that this really is a book full of powerful female characters who are not objectified, who are not fetishized. It doesn't feel, this book, here's what it is. This series never feels male gazy to me, really, ever. There's one moment where it kind of went there in the third book at the beginning, and then it totally got undercut right after that. And like, huge shout out to Mark Lawrence for proving that it's not impossible for male authors to do this, and that like, part of what makes this book unique is the fact that he does have so many female characters, and like that he's genuinely interested in exploring that psychology. So I just think character-wise, this book has so many great, memorable characters who you will love, like Nona, Abbess Glass, Apple and Kettle. Sisters Apple and Sister Kettle are my heart. I love them so much. I love all of Nona's friends like Ara and Darla and Ruli and Jula. Like there's so many great just like side characters in this world. I also really love Regal. That was great. There's just like there's a ton of memorable, interesting characters. I will tell you that he's not afraid to kill off a character you love. So if you like your fantasy pretty stabby and pretty like dark, this has got you. Like it definitely goes there. But yeah, I just thought the characters in this were great. And then in terms of the themes in this series, I mean, there's just so many places you could go. There's a lot here to talk about. We could get into the whole like nature nurture thing I was mentioning earlier. I think because this is about nuns, there's a lot of really interesting interplay about faith and the role of faith or true belief versus religion as something to control people. Like that is explored a lot. And I think it's really cool to see a series that has a lot of people with a lot of range of both beliefs in terms of like their actual, like what religion they're practicing, but also like how they feel about that religion. Like, I think it's cool to see Nona kind of develop in her own faith practices or like how she thinks about faith. In the convent, you definitely see a range of people who are like true hardcore believers in the Ancestor, and others who see the church as more of a means to an end kind of thing. There's competing religious ideologies in this, so that gets explored. Like there's a whole bunch that you could talk about in this book in terms of like church / like religion stuff. And I really liked that a lot. And I appreciated seeing it incorporated in a way that was really thoughtful into this kind. Like religion is throughout the span of human history, a huge force. And I think sometimes in fiction, it's hard to get good explorations of religion because it often even goes to a place that's quite on either side, it goes to a didactic place really easily of like either very pro or very against religion. And I think that it's really admirable, and like I like in fiction when we can have sort of like a more full expression of the human experience of faith or metaphysical or existential experience. And I thought that in this fantasy world, because it's not like, oh, this is like, I think it wasn't totally clear, like, oh, this is the Christianity stand-in. Like there's elements of Christianity in the ancestor worship, but I think that there's definitely like, it's not like a 1-for-1 kind of thing with any of these religions, I don't think. So I really appreciated that. And I thought it led to some really interesting kind of explorations of those themes. And then, I think another thing in here that I absolutely love, like I said, was basically this is a book about the impacts of climate change and thinking about our agency in that and like what it means to have that level of like existential threat to the people who live on this planet. Like, yeah, like some of this might be because I just started listening to The Uninhabitable Earth and it is bleak and really challenging me in terms of how I can be a part of collective action on climate change. But suffice it to say, climate change is going to be the defining force of the 21st century. Like, we're still sort of not denying climate change. I mean, there are still some people like that, but just, I think collectively as humanity, we have not confronted how big of a threat to our existence that is yet. And I am down for any book that helps us through fiction to kind of contemplate what it means to have an existential threat that all of us have to reckon with, regardless of like religion, race, country, political part, whatever. Like, we all live here and we're all gonna have to figure out how to deal with this. So any book that like starts us like engaging our empathetic imagination to go down that path, like, I'm down for. And yeah, I've actually heard that Leanna from Leanna's Library was telling me that he has another series that a lot of people don't like because the main character is unlikable, but the premise is basically like post-apocalyptic medieval Europe. So like, the apocalypse happened, I think it was maybe climate related, and like you're back in medieval Europe. So this is apparently, I think, thematically something Mark Lawrence is interested in. I believe he is a research scientist of some kind. So like, I think he's somebody who is clearly actively thinking about that stuff. And I really appreciated that, like, being a part of this fictitious world in terms of like some of the ideas it was reckoning with. So anyway, I honestly probably could do a full, like, I would love to have full book club about this series because it's so good. I think there's so much to talk about. And you know, it's just one of those rare series that I can just wholeheartedly recommend to people, because I think if you are not usually a fantasy reader, but like you're open to it, I could see this being a pretty friendly place to start, because it's only a trilogy. All of them are out now, and it's written well, like it's well written, and it's got enough like thematic depth to it, and it has a lot of mystery plots that I think that there's a lot of like cross genre appeal. There's a lot of ways into this series, basically, in terms of just like a lot of people who might like it. I think that it could be a really good bridging trilogy for people who have been reading YA and want to start reading adult, just because there is a boarding school element to it. It has like really interesting and fun characters. So if that's what you come to a book for, this has got that. Like, it's just a book, it's a trilogy I can really wholeheartedly recommend. Like, it just was really enjoyable. I enjoyed my time reading it. And I also it was thought-provoking and well executed all around. Like, I really enjoyed this and would definitely recommend, if you're somebody who is down with the idea of a trilogy and open, I totally recommend this. I think it was, for me at least, it really, really worked and was really, really good. So anyway, those were my discombobulated thoughts about the Book of the Ancestor series. Like I said, wholeheartedly recommend. Definitely going to be one of my favorite series of the year, some of my favorite books of the year. Just really excellent all around. So if you have read this series, definitely let me know in the comments what you thought about it. You know, of course, not every book is for everybody, so I'm sure there's going to be people out there who didn't enjoy it, but I think the general consensus from what I've seen is that people are really liking this. So definitely let me know what you think. And if you are interested in reading it, I hope that you will consider doing that. I think that will do it for me for now. So if you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, follow me on the social medias if you are so inclined. I have all that information listed in the description box below, and I think that will do it. Hope you're having a really great day, and I will just talk to you soon. Bye.